Hey everyone, I'm Dan Storms. I'm a product lead at XO Group. I'm delighted to be here. I'm one of the organizers of the conference. We're going to get our panelists to line up here under their photos, so there's no confusion at all. Thank you.
Oh, wait, here.
Oh, yeah, there you go, thanks. All right, have a seat. We're so excited to be here. We have the longest named panel evaluating a company's product strategy during the interview process. It's quite long, but Brent and I were thinking about what the community would find really valuable as we put together these panels. And one of the really hard things during the interview process is not just understanding the role and the team and the company and that kind of thing, but really what is the product strategy of the company from the outside? Because it's typically not something that's published that broadly, unless it's Elon Musk's master plan or something, right? We brought this group of wonderful people together. They work for a diverse set of companies, which we're really excited about, and we're just going to dig into that. And we're going to do something a little bit different to some of the other panels, which is we're probably going to go for about 25 minutes with some questions, and then I'm going to take a whole bunch of questions from the audience, so have some questions prepared, and we'd love to get you engaged and asking questions as much as we can answer here. So why don't you kick us off, just do quick intros, and we'll go around and we'll dive right in.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Greene. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Handy. Handy is a marketplace for home services like cleaning and handyman, and we're changing the way the world buys services.
Hey everyone, I'm Megan Palatino. I'm on the product team at Instagram, and I work on Instagram Home. Prior to that, I spent about 6 years in the early stage startup scene here in New York, working at a variety of stage companies.
Hey everyone, I'm Nate Stewart. I'm the VP of Product at Cockroach Labs. We build a very resilient SQL database that powers the next generation of internet applications.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Chesleigh. I'm the VP of Product and Engineering at One Kings Lane. We are, I was going to say e-commerce company, but that's not true because we just opened up a store in Soho. So an omni-channel company that focuses on home furnishings and decor.
Great. So let's just ask a couple of questions of the audience here. How many people are, say, aspiring PMs? We got a pretty good number, although it's hard to see with the lights. How many people are at the product manager level? Okay. How many people are senior product managers and directors? Okay. And then I'll do like VP, CPO, head of product, chief Yahoo, whatever that is. Any of those? Okay, great. Great. And then like non-product person, so people that are enthusiasts. Okay, we've got a few of those as well. All right. So we wanted to give a sense of this. So we've got kind of got a core right around senior product manager, but I think that's a good way for us to think about that. We'll be talking primarily at that level here. So while we were prepping, I asked the panelists here to think of some stories, how they went through this process of evaluating it, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So maybe Rebecca, can I start with you? It's like tell us a story about when you evaluated a company's product strategy and just dive into that.
Sure. So when I joined Handy, I did not join in a product capacity, so that wasn't really top of mind for me. But before I was at Handy, I was at Amazon in product management out in San Francisco in their digital music group. And when I joined digital music, I was very focused on product strategy because Amazon was the second largest seller of digital music, but they had been pretty late to streaming. And at the time, they were kind of swapping the business model and product strategy from digital sales to Prime Music streaming. And what I kind of was trying to assess during that time was why were they going to win? Because they were pretty far behind the curve. Spotify, YouTube, et cetera, like everyone had already moved to streaming. And one of the things that I learned is that there are a number of dimensions that you can assess a product strategy. One is certainly the feature set, like radio and playlists and things like that. But then there's things like what's the pricing model, what's the platform the service is going to be available on. In music, content is really important, all of that, and as well like customer segment. And as I was going through that interview process, I kind of discovered that Amazon had a pretty differentiated strategy for that. So they weren't going after like super young millennials, they were going after an older demographic. So country music was like a big part of their catalog. They didn't need 6-month-old music, like they were doing a different model to keep costs down. And then they were going to reward customers by with a pricing model that music was going to be wrapped into Prime Music. And so they had an advantage there where into the Prime offering where you didn't actually have to pay extra for music. And critically, now it's obvious, but it wasn't at the time, but they were in the process of building out Echo. And so the platform was going to be really different, and they were going to deliver music over a completely different paradigm and platform than anyone else had. And that's how they really thought they were going to kind of drive adoption.
And they knew that at the time. Like
and they
that
knew
was
that at the
something
time.
Specifically conscious at the time that they thought that we're going to bet here and therefore also bet here.
Yeah, and that's like the most obvious example of something that wouldn't have been public, that if you really dug in the interview process and really asked the question, like, how are you guys going to win? You're so far behind, that those are the kinds of things that came out.
So you think you would have been able to find that out in the interview process or no?
Well, they were secret projects at the time, so like not every piece of it, but they would talk about how different, platform, you should really think about that. So they didn't tell us it was a home device and it was going to work this way, but they were making a case that they were going to have a new platform in the home that was going to take it away. Same with the monetization model or the pricing model. They were pretty straightforward, saying it was going to be part of Prime and all of that. So I think like with probing and really pushing to say like, why are you going to win? It was clear that there was like answers for each of these dimensions, and it wasn't just like, oh, because like streaming is big and like we're a big company.
Right. If we just get 1% of the market, it'll be fine.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Megan, what have you been thinking about?
Yeah, so earlier on in my career, I was interviewing with a company that was building a highly complex machine learning powered product. And I remember being, probably in the second or third round of interviews, and I'd met with 5 or 6 people from the company at that time. And every interview we had, I would try to dig into the technology. And not having a machine learning background, I had a ton of questions about how the product worked. I remember asking to see the product, and over again, I would leave these interviews thinking, wow, everyone here is really smart and very abstract. I can't figure out what the product does. And I just remember, I was younger, and I remember, just chalking it up to the fact that I had no ML experience, and most likely it was me that wasn't understanding. And as I sort of dug further into it, it became clear that their customers were having a really hard time understanding what the product did as well. I ended up taking that job, and after joining the product team, it was more apparent than ever that they had a really hard time describing what their technology did to the average customer. If it was, in retrospect, it was a red flag that if the product team can't describe to you how the product works and what the value prop is to the user, they're probably going to have a really hard time providing market value to their customers. So in retrospect, I wish I had dug further into it. It was an incredible experience learning about all the things that I would want to ask about while interviewing a company for whether or not I want to work there. In the end, they worked through this murky time in their technology, and actually I was part of the product team that helped clarify what the vision and the value prop was to users.
Interesting. All right, Nate, what do you got?
Awesome. So the time where I spent the most time evaluating a product strategy was in my transition from a director of product to a head of product and now a VP role. And I spent a lot of time on strategy here because the opportunity cost was huge. Like that was going to be my one big move to get my career in the place that I wanted. And B, because it was part of the interview. So once you're going in at a more senior product leadership role, you actually usually need to come in with a platform. And so you can't really do that if you don't know the space. And so what I had to do was come up with different ways to evaluate different companies' strategies pretty quickly. There are a lot of ways to do this that they teach you in business school, like Porter's 5 forces. There's, everyone's familiar with the SWOT model. I use something that's called the 5 Cs, which is just company profile, customers, competitors, who are their partners or collaborators. But the most interesting one is the context in which this business is operating. So what are the big trends that are happening that are making this a great time to be in that business or a bad time to be in that business? And for Cockroach Labs, after a lot of conversations with some of their customers, their investors, and some of their competitors, I realized it was the move to the cloud that was that compelling event. That was going to make all of that money that's going to Oracle finally be up for grabs as people are going through these IT transformations or these digital transformations. So if someone was able to build a SQL database that worked very well in the cloud, they'd have an outsized advantage in winning that market. So that's why I went with Cockroach.
Did you actually present that 5 Cs during the interview process to the company?
No, so
Used as for your kind of like for your own information.
yeah, so for all of those strategy frameworks, I just think of that as the scaffolding for coming up with my approach or for the strategy that I present. So it's just a way to make sure you're getting a full picture of what's going on before you actually present your recommendation.
Got it. Cool. All right. Andrea, you have something?
Yeah,
there?
I mean, similarly, just like Nate, I think about it as frameworks, right? Because at the end of the day, we're product people, we're probably nerdy. I know I'm very nerdy. So I like to think about things in frameworks. So I look at it in 3 steps. There's the pre-interview work that I do, so the research phase, which really is all about, I look at what the company is doing, what the industry is doing, who are the founders and who am I meeting with, maybe the head of product, and looking at all of that, then playing with the product, because at the end of the day, I think what really needs to happen is how do you tie what they are saying publicly, what is out there in the market versus what you're seeing in the experience, which I then take into step 2, which is during the interview process. I really try to personalize the questions that I have towards the research that I found. And then lastly, if you can, obviously validate through some sort of back channeling through your network. So an example of this is when I was interviewing at Zappos. Because if you think about it, early in your career, you're probably just sort of like, oh, please take me. I felt that way about Zappos, definitely, please take me. However, in my research phase, I had read Tony's book, Delivering Happiness. So I understood that really the way that they looked at it is they are a customer service company that happened to sell shoes. However, they were moving into other verticals like clothing. And so during the interview process, I played with the product. I could see that the clothing positioning was not as crisp as the shoes approach. So during the interview, I asked those questions about, well, where do you see yourself in terms of clothing? How do you want to position Zappos as sort of, is it going to be the leader in clothing like they are in shoes? And they were very honest. They were very transparent about the fact that they didn't have a very clear product strategy. And actually, this is what their role was for, was to help shape that product strategy. And it's a good thing I asked those questions, because let me tell you, day one, my first day at Zappos was at a clothing strategy offsite, and I spent the first 3 months in a clothing war room. So it was very good that I teased all of that out. Otherwise, I would have been like, hell is this? So
Clothing
aside from
war
please take me.
Right. So you started this, but I want to continue with the rest of the group here. Tell us a little bit about what techniques you would use or tools or places you would go to learn about a company's product strategy. Anybody want to just jump in? Nate?
Sure. So the techniques and tools differed with how much time I had to evaluate these companies. So again, when I was going for the VP type roles, I could spend 10, 20 hours on the stuff, no problem. But when I was an individual contributor just trying to get in the door, I could spend 1 or 2 hours. The things that I found most valuable were looking at the 10K reports of comparable companies. So if you have let's say a database in this case, I can look at another database that's public, see what are the things that are top of mind for the CEO, see what the CEO's risks are, what types of companies they're going against, and that really helps inform my decision. The other thing that's really important following on that is listening into the earnings calls. Those are huge because it's the same content, but now there's a Q&A portion to it. So yes, the CEO says, hey, this is what I think the world looks like, but then you can see how that person responds to hard questions from an analyst. And then the last big thing that I did was I looked at Harvard case studies for comparable companies. So in this case, it's an open source database. How in the world do you monetize open source? Well, it just so happened that MySQL took a similar pattern to us. Harvard wrote up a 20-page case study on it, and I could see the way that strategy played out. So those are some of the techniques that I used.
Rebecca?
Yeah, so HBS case studies are great, especially for private companies as well, because it's hard to find information and real analysis about private companies or startups. And then I would say for specifically private companies and startups, the best thing is to speak to people who either work there or formerly work there and get kind of like back channel information about the startup, since there's not a ton of resources out there. Obviously anything that like the founders publish or things like that you can read, but those are obviously going to be very one-sided, so it's good to get a balanced point of view.
Yeah, I agree with both of you said. I think digging into the competitive landscape is extremely important, and identifying what their differentiator is amongst their competitors. Also asking a lot of questions about their current business model and thinking about how that compares with the business models of the competitors that are out there is really interesting. A lot of startups will, beta test their technology with other startups. So chances are you probably know someone who's a customer of the company that you're interviewing for. And I think that's a nice route to try and, backhandedly figure out, what do they like about the product? What jobs did they hire this product for? And is it solving their needs? And then I personally always like to ask to see the product myself and get a chance to play around with it if it's possible. Definitely as someone who's about to go build that part of the product, I think it's really important. And that doesn't often happen in interviews. And so I always make a point either at the end of the full loop round to ask to spend some time in the product if it's not something I'm already using.
Cool. So are there signals that the strategy is going well that you can, like, that jump out to you as you're talking to people or doing this research?
I mean, I think I start with KPIs, right? Again, a very product-y thing to do. But so if you look at it's a startup, are there, are there increasing valuations at each stage? Are there increasing revenue rate? How are they what is the rollout cadence of their products? Because I think you can really tell quite a bit from there. And then during the interview phase, talking to, again, head of product or the founders, how do they tie that back to these KPIs? And can they articulate the strategy that has led to this very tangible proof of how the company is doing? Because again, I think looking at that first, there's a lot of information out there, even the research that you can do before you start the interview process.
Other signals?
Yeah, I would also, again, for private companies or startups, would look to see if investors from previous rounds have followed on. It's a signal if they haven't, unless it gets to it's a seed stage and it gets to growth stage. But for the most part, I think you can figure out which investors should be following on. And so that's a good signal if they are, and a bad signal if they're not. And that doesn't mean that's a deal breaker, but it just means you probably should ask the question and maybe even try to talk to investors in a back channel way as well.
One other thing I like to dig into is what's like the lifespan of the product team. Is there high turnover or not? And I think it's always a really good signal if the PMs have stuck around for more than a year. And that's something that usually, if it's not going well, you'll hear that there's a lot of turnover on the team.
Yeah.
And on the for me, one of the things that I look at is the how expensive it is for competitors to respond. So, for example, again, going back to Cockroach DB, we have a database that's SQL that works very well across many machines. And once we found out that this is something that very big companies care a lot about, we started seeing that, okay, now Oracle wants to take their database that runs on one machine and make it go across many machines. That's extremely hard to do. And for a company like Oracle to mobilize their company and to even get that type of talent in-house, that's astronomically expensive, where incrementally for us to build on that, it's very easy for us. On the other side, if you look at companies that are distributed databases but don't have SQL, to add that type of capability to a database that wasn't built that way from the start, it's very, very expensive. If you look at MongoDB, they just went public, but they're slowly starting to add more types of SQL-like guarantees. Again, very, very difficult, and they may not have the capabilities in-house to do that. So once you find product market fit and you see that your competitors can't actually move into where you are, that's usually a good sign that your strategy is working.
So that's interesting. You just said that understand the differentiator of that company that you're considering, and then evaluate the competitors, and then evaluate how hard it is for the competitors to move into like taking over that differentiator.
Right. I mean, the way that I think about strategy, it's just what are the activities you were doing that are both valuable and hard to copy. It's not easy to see what's valuable, but it's the hard to copy part that really builds that moat or competitive advantage, as some people say.
I heard that somewhere.
Yeah.
Some of you might know that one from Gib. Great. Are there? So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll take some from the audience. Are there any like big red flags, like definitely run away if something? Have you encountered that? So you, Megan, you hinted at one, which was like if they can't describe it at all, probably not good. But you still went there, and you still were able to influence it. So that's interesting. Anything else?
I mean, to piggyback on what Megan said, so either they can't articulate it or they're articulating it in a very sort of empty buzzwords kind of way, and there's nothing to tie it back to, right? So I think you and I were talking about this notion of building a seamless way to build community, what does that really mean?
Buzzword bingo. I love
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's definitely a red flag, although I would say this, right? I think evaluating product strategy is important, but that's not the only thing to look at when you're evaluating your next move. And so I would say there's definitely value in learning. So yes, you might see a red flag. Don't go to a company that's going to close their doors tomorrow, but don't forget that there might be something that's interesting in how they position themselves in the market. Maybe something you can learn from the founders or the head of product or the product itself. Just remember that there is value in learning, and not to forget that again, you want to make sure you're looking at the product strategy, but there's everything else that you need to assess.
I think some red flags for me are if someone says that pricing is their advantage, or it looks like the pricing itself is why the company is growing so much because it's so discounted, but there's nothing that describes why they have a pricing advantage. Like, do they have a lower cost model, or is there something there? That likely means venture funding is just funding the lower price in the short term, and that's probably not sustainable in the long term. So that's a big red flag for me. And I also think similarly, if you look at how much venture funding the actual company has gotten relative to the industry, if it looks like it's an industry like that's just in a fundraising war, and that the company is possibly just getting higher and higher valuations and raising more funding just because that's like venture capitalists are just pouring money into it, but you don't see why. Like, you don't see why the value of that industry is growing so fast or why so much money is going on into it. I think that's a bizarre red flag because you want to kind of chase things that you think are like gaining a lot of attention, but ultimately as a shareholder, like, you may end up being in a worse position as a result of that kind of a fundraising war.
Interesting.
Yeah, one other thought. One of the frameworks that I like to use is the jobs to be done framework, which is basically a spin on user problems. And I think it's really interesting to dig into that specifically in the interview process, because it really gives you a sense of how people at the company are thinking about their customers. And if they can't clearly articulate why someone chooses you and your product to do a specific job, I think that's a really big red flag. And I highly recommend that anyone who's never heard of that framework, check it out, because I think it's a very interesting way for product people to think about their space and value propositions without getting stuck in solving problems. It's a sort of the way you frame jobs to be done. You're thinking about opportunities, and I really like that.
Yeah, and the red flag for me, especially when I'm evaluating a company, is just if I don't see that they have the capability to execute their strategy. So if their strategy is building out a API platform, okay, where are your integration experts? Or if their strategy is building a consumer grade blah, 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 okay, where's your great designer? And if they don't have the capability to execute their strategy, and that's something you can do just by looking at the LinkedIn profiles of who's actually in that company, that's also a red flag.
Cool. All right, so who's got some questions? Right here? Oh, I'll repeat. No, go ahead.
A couple of people mentioned that you can still join a company even if they don't have the strongest product strategy. How do you tease out in the interview process your ability to influence their product strategy, even at the product manager or VP level? You still might be reporting up into block from closely.
All right, so thank you for the question. How do you evaluate your ability to impact the product strategy of the company, and make your decisions around that?
I can take that. And it's a great question. I think one of the things you can dig into in the interview process is the company business-driven or product-driven, and really understand how product decisions are being made. In earlier stage startups where there may not be a head of product and you might be reporting into the COO or the CEO, I think it's really important to understand how that person influences the decisions made. Try and meet with that person in the interview process. And for me, it's always important to meet with who my cross-functional counterparts will be. So who's the head of engineering, who's the head of design, how do they think about product, what are they looking for in a product leader? I think through all of those conversations, you'll get a really strong sense of how you may influence if the opportunity is there to influence it. And specifically, in companies where you're a little bit, you find that their product strategy is maybe not quite robust in the interview process, I think you really should look at it as an opportunity. And as long as there's space for you to get in there and influence, it's a great opportunity to have at a startup.
What else? Over here?
I think that answer sort of leads into what I was going to ask. I think we're talking a lot about strategy, but I also wanted to ask about culture. I feel like one of the hardest things to suss out during an interview is the health of the relationship of the product organization relative to partner organizations. And in interviews, they always want to say that a company is product forward or that the relationship with product is mature. But what is the best way to validate that?
Yeah, so the context of the question is about culture. How do you evaluate the health of the product organization and their relationship with the other parts of the company? Did I get that right? Yeah. Anybody?
So I think similarly, meeting with your cross-functional partners, I think outside of the immediate analytics, design, engineering, having conversations with marketing, having conversations with business development, or if you're in an e-commerce company, perhaps merchandising, and trying to understand what their relationship with product is and how they, a question that I always like to ask is, well, how do you partner with product? Because I think that's going to tease out, do they see product as an executional role versus as a thought partner? And I think that will also help figure out the culture of product within an organization.
Anything else? All right. What else? Right here.
What experience would you get? What advice would you get for pivoting across fields and industry? I'm sure most of you, not all of you, have done it. We see it all the time with outputs, B2C preferred, healthcare experience preferred. So what advice would you get?
Yeah, great. The question is about advice for people looking to change sort of main industry verticals or kind of types of products or that kind of thing. And yeah, how would you do that?
So I could take that. So in my career, I've moved from finance to consulting to product at a large tech company to operations and growth at a startup and then back to product. So that's not even like B2B and B2C. So, but we put those things on our role specs too, because you try to put what the perfect candidate would be. But ultimately, A, you should definitely apply, even if you don't meet all the requirements on the page. And B, I think you just need to understand why they're asking for that experience and what it is in your experience or in your interest and engagement and the work ethic you're going to put into the role that kind of trumps and makes up for that gap, and just demonstrating that interest level and passion, et cetera, through the interview process. I think, maybe it changes at the VP role or higher, but before that, nothing trumps, intelligence and passion and work ethic, in my opinion. None of us have 50 years of healthcare experience or anything like that. So I think you should always just think of it that way.
Yeah, I usually have good experience when I was doing career changes in going with startups where they need someone who has general intelligence, a general athlete that they can build into the type of product manager they want. That's assuming you have a good manager to support you through that. Because the thing that I found that I definitely disagree with is all of these PM roles that require computer science backgrounds. I'm VP of product at a freaking database, and none of my none of my PMs are computer science majors, and that's fine because they're good at solving problems and they're good at communicating with cross-functional stakeholders, and that's what really matters to me. So as companies get larger, the types of product roles they have get more specific, and it gets a little bit harder there. But I find if you go to smaller companies, you have a better chance of making that type of switch.
What else? Pretty close here. Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you guys, in an interview,
Great. So the question is, what are some ways you differentiate yourself as a product person when you're interviewing? Yeah.
All right, I'll take it.
Good question.
I'm thinking going on.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned this before, but when I was doing all of the strategy work, the 2 hours or so for my individual
Is it
contributor
really
role.
just 2 hours? Because that sounds really short to me.
Well, I mean, at the time I was applying to a lot of roles, right?
Okay.
4 hours times 10 roles. That's
Wow,
that's a lot.
All right. Sorry.
But I can do it really quick. But the thing that I would do is, after I was done putting together my thoughts, I would actually create a deck. Like, this is my point of view on company XYZ strategy, and that's something that I would actually bring to the interview. And that was useful for a couple of things. A, it showed that I cared about their product, but B, it helped me collect my thoughts, and when I'm asking questions, ask very pointed questions. So, if you're putting together the company strategy and you say, hey, these two things don't match, if you bring that up during an interview as a question, you're talking to a founder or something, they're going to remember that. So that worked really well for me.
Yeah, it's good practice too, just like, because it's something you don't get to do day to day most of the time, right? So like having that practice really helps build that skill set. What else is differentiating?
I mean, very similar to Nate. I mean, this is why I talked about the framework of research and then using that research to fuel your questions. Because what I do, I mean, I don't know about the 2 hours, but we'll try. I do the research, and then I definitely spend time with the product. And don't just play with it, use it if you can. And that will fuel your conversation, and that's how you're going to stand out during the interview process, because the points that you're making, the conversation that you're having, the questions you're asking are very pointed and very specific to the business and the product that they have. And again, same thing, your interviewer is going to remember you for that. Mm-hmm. I don't come with a deck, though.
There you go. That's how you stand out.
Differentiated.
There you go.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I also think that as you are already a product manager and as you're thinking about the next role, like, you're more informed about what you're passionate about and what kind of roles you don't want to take, not just roles, but types of companies or platforms. And so I think you should actually start narrowing the number of companies you apply to. And by nature of narrowing it, you'll actually be smarter about those companies and more passionate about their products, et cetera. And I think that will actually shine through. So it's not you like going over and above necessarily in any particular way, but being more honest with yourself about what you're passionate and smartest about and the types of companies that you really will do best at, and I think that will show through. It definitely shows when people have applied to like 20 different companies and they get there and they're just like not that smart about your business or product. And I think by narrowing a little bit, like, that will just come through for you.
Mm-hmm.
I just have one last thought on that. I agree with everything that everyone said. I would just say also just be authentic, be yourself, and be really clear about what you're looking for. At the end of the day, they're hiring you and you're going to be working with them on a daily basis, and you want them to know who you are, what your strengths are as a product person, even what your weaknesses are and what you're looking to work on. At least that's been my strategy, and so far it's worked.
Cool. What else? John D, right there. I know a couple of people's names right in that corner.
So we've been talking a lot about product strategy, but there's also obviously vision and tactics, right? Those kind of all come together. I guess the question is, whenever you think about product strategy or strategy overall for a business, and you decision against those three factors at least, as with obviously others, how important is the strategy versus those tactics and how the business is executing, as well as the vision of where they're going? I think that when you're a PM in that context, it might be a little bit different.
Okay, so when you're PM, how important is vision versus strategy versus execution kind of approach? I want to ask you to rank them, and if you want to, that'd be interesting. But like, how do you, some sense of relative importance of those three things?
I can speak.
Yeah, go ahead. Wow.
Sure. So, assuming you're applying to startups, for me, it's vision, number one, then execution, then strategy. Because as far as I'm concerned, at a small enough startup, the strategy doesn't necessarily matter if they can't make it to those next milestones.
But that's the whole point of the panel.
Fair enough. But that's where you can provide value as a product manager.
Deck. It's okay.
That is the whole point of the panel. But finding a CEO with a good vision, they're going to be able to figure it out. They're going to be able to hire the people that are going to make them successful, and it's going to give them enough runway to actually get a strategy that makes sense. When I was at a company called Percolate. I joined when they were just a social media marketing company, and the CEO just had a vision for how marketing was in the dark ages and how he was going to transform it with software. And their social media strategy didn't work so well. They ended up having a ton of competitors. Then they went to this enterprise marketing platform. That was okay, but then they realized enterprise content marketing was ultimately the strategy that worked for them, and they were actually able to build a competitive advantage there. But if that CEO didn't have the vision, he wouldn't have been able to get the people in the company in the first place, including myself. So vision, then execution, then strategy at a startup.
Got it. Andrea, you have some thoughts?
I mean, at a startup, very similarly, but I think I will always lean on vision and strategy first, because for me as the interviewer, I'm going to test and pressure test you anyway on your grit and your ability to execute, right? So what I hope to in any company that I join as a PM, what I hope that I would get is the ability to think about what those tactics are. And so it's a lot more important to me to make sure that the vision and strategy is there, because we should be asking why. We should be asking, why are we doing this? What are the problems that we're solving? It's very easy to come up with the tactics and then going and executing them. But at the end of the day, to me, those two things have to come first.
All right. What else? Dave Z.
So y'all just taught 100 product managers how to evaluate a company's product strategy during the interview process, which is awesome. From the point of view of the company, how do you ensure that from the listing to the recruiter to the phone screener, et cetera, that if one of those folks along the line gets asked a question about product strategy, that everyone's in alignment and then it's being articulated properly?
So the question is, how do you ensure through all the touch points in the interview process that the product strategy is articulated consistently and properly?
So there's for Cockroach Labs, we just say, I gave everyone in the company a very simple tagline, which is just taking advantage of the move to the cloud to displace Oracle, period. And that came, no big deal. It's not very fancy, but it's something that sticks. It's something that the recruiter can say. It's something that an engineer can say, and it gives candidates a consistent understanding of what we're doing. So there's this book called Made to Stick, which is about taking complex ideas and making them simple and repeatable. And so I definitely take a look at that if you're looking for a way to get an entire company to be on the same page from a messaging perspective.
Cool. What else?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously work at a large company, but at Facebook and Instagram, we go through an interview calibration process. So any person who's talking to an external candidate has to go through pretty extensive training before they're able to do that. That's easier for a bigger company to support than a smaller one, but I think you can still do some level of that. And that's something that actually product people should probably advocate for, especially if you're sort of later down the chain in the interview process. You want to make sure that those initial screens and recruiting conversations are really articulating the strategy as well.
Yeah, we have a recruiting playbook at Handy that we use that anyone who interviews has to have gone through some sort of training, probably not as rigorous, but to make sure that they understand that playbook in general and the types of questions we ask, but also how we kind of describe our company and our product strategy.
Interesting. The rigor is a little surprising to me, but that's really interesting. What else? In the back.
Do you have any suggestions for when you're interviewing with someone with a company that's very small and this is their first product position that they're hiring for? Specifically with smaller companies. I know there's some larger ones that are doing it at kind of late stage, but how would you go about evaluating what their strategy is when they haven't ever had a product?
So the scenario you describe is a company, the startup in this case, is hiring their first PM, and you're interviewing for that role, and so you want to evaluate.
First product role, like not even just a PM, like they've never had CEO or anything.
Okay, got it. They've never had anybody who does product at all, and you're trying to evaluate that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking that they're going to have a product strategy or a way of articulating that is probably naive, or you're going to be disappointed. I think At that point, you want to make sure you believe in the founders and the founding team, and that you evaluate them, like the quality of person they are, the vision that they have overall for the company, and maybe some of the things they think that a product hire can add to the company, so you can understand, like, is there room for product to help in making decisions, and do they recognize the need there? And then on the other side, I think you want to validate that there's a need, and there's a user need or a user problem or pain point. And then I think as the first product hire, it's going to be part of your job to figure out what the product is, what the value prop, what that strategy is. So I would just make sure the team is good, and the space that you're operating in and all of that, and that you truly believe that there's an actual user problem or need that this company is going to solve.
Yeah, great. I'm going to throw one out. So are there any books, blogs, or resources you would recommend? Nate, you mentioned Made to Stick. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, that's just general communication.
Okay, got it. What else?
I have two books that I've kind of been into lately. One is related to the jobs to be done theory. It's called Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen, I think. And then I just read Ray Dalio's Principles, which I think is a great book. It's kind of all the hype right now, but it's a really great way to guide decision making on a product team and in life. So I recommend that one.
Great. What else? Andrea?
I guess I'm going to say it. There's wonderful talks and writings by one Gibson Biddle.
Oh, wow.
Ben Thompson, Stratechery. I know not quite directly product, but Benedict Evans from A16Z is really good. And trying to think, who else do I really? Oh, and Trent Griffin, who is from Microsoft. So a lot of their writings really on Twitter. Fantastic.
Yeah, I like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I don't know if anyone's read that book. I don't remember the author, but it takes a lot of the academic aspects of strategy and just says, hey, here's what strategy is, and here's all the different ways that it fails in the real world. So reading that book is pretty fun because right away you'll say, oh crap, we have a bad strategy. You know, it's like, and that's just what it is. So that's a good one. And then the other one, which is more academic, is the classic HBR on strategy. And it's just a collection of articles on thinking about competitive advantage.
Becca?
I read a couple of Christensen's works. I'm gonna forget what his first ones, or the Innovator's Dilemma, I think is my favorite of his. It's old school companies, but I think it's still super applicable. And then I learned mostly through reading about companies, actually reading an article about the company, going to the site, looking at the roles they're hiring for, what the strategy is, playing with the product, et cetera. More so in context, learning that way rather than reading someone's point of view about it.
Interesting. What else? Anybody? Got one right here?
Yeah, just to expand on that point, are there any, even outside of the interview process, are there any activities or exercises that you guys go through on even a semi-regular basis to learn these skills and kind of hone this ability to look at a company and understand it strategically?
Aside from going to a conference? So the question is, how do you, what are some exercises or approaches you can take to develop the skill of sort of doing product strategy? Is that right? Yeah.
This is going to sound really weird, and my team is here, but I think regularly stretching the interview muscles, even though you're not looking. Again, it might sound funny, but I think that's very true. So taking a call every month, every couple of months, forces you to do that research, forces you to have those conversations, and whether it's in a very informal way because you're maybe just taking coffee with somebody, I think that helps quite a bit.
Yeah. What else? Nate? All right. You're the one.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the books that I read. I don't want to say the cop out of go to business school, because that's one of the things that they teach you there. But a lot of the different business schools have their classes online. So there's this idea from MIT called open courseware, where you may not get the video from the talks, or from the classes, but you'll get the syllabi, the different reading materials, and you can start to see, okay, these are some tools and techniques for evaluating strategy. The 3 frameworks that I talked about at the beginning, those are some things that you could pay a bunch of money for business school, or you could just go on OpenCourseWare and get the same material for a fraction. of the cost.
For me, I think there's probably three things that I do. One, I come to conferences when I can. I have a couple groups of PMs that I meet with regularly from previous jobs, and sometimes it's just for social events, but other times we actually talk product, and it's really interesting to listen to the challenges that everyone's facing at any given time. That's really helpful. And the third one is I've recently started mentoring young founders, so early stage founders, and I think that's, for me now, not working in the startup space, that's been really awesome to keep that muscle sharpened and to help them think through some of the challenges they're dealing with as they try to define a product strategy.
Anything else? Questions? Right here. Okay, great. Question is, how do you leverage your strategy when you're trying to close a candidate?
I can take that. What I really try to do is make it relevant to the candidate and paint the picture of how their contribution, what they bring to the table, what they can do to help push that strategy forward. And so you make it personal because, again, this is what you're hoping to do is get this candidate. So making sure that it's very relevant to that person so that it's clear is what we tend to do.
Great. Okay, well, we're out of time, so I'm going to wrap up here. We've got a break, hooray, until 3:45. So please be back in here at 3:45. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you for all the great questions, and see you back soon.